Hi, hello everyone. I'm Hadil, and today we're going to talk about beveling edges and vertices in Blender. Let's start with the default cube this time. In the past video, we talked about beveling curves, but today we'll start with beveling mesh that you added directly in Blender. So there are multiple ways to bevel a mesh. And the first one is using the modifiers tab. If you go over here, the modifier properties tab, and then you want to add a modifier called bevel, and immediately you're going to see a bevel around all the edges in this cube. The only time I use bevel in the modifier is if I know I want to change the bevel later on. I don't know how much beveling I need, or I want to bevel all of the edges. So the bevel modifier is the best choice for that. And when it comes to the settings that I change, I only change the amount in the segments. When it comes to the width type, I just keep it at offset just because it works for me, or it works for what I want to create. And if you go online on YouTube or any resource that teaches Blender, you're gonna find someone that talked about all of these. So if you want to know more about any of the other ones, then feel free to do so. But for now, I'm going to show you my workflow. And in my workflow, I only use the amount in segments. I usually go from 2 to 3 in segments because I think that's the cleanest if you want to round the edges. But if you want a bevel that looks angular, then this is going to be your choice. But for me, it's usually 2 or 3, depending on how big the bevel is. So I'll go at 3. And then for the amount, I usually go with 0.05 or even 0.01 if I'm just trying to add that sheen over here to make it a little bit more natural. Then if I disable this right now, you're going to see that it doesn't really look 3D other than it has different shadings for the different faces. And then if I want to bevel the corners instead, I can just do vertices. And the bigger it is, you're going to see that it bevels the corners. And if I reduce the segments, you're going to see it actually better. But because there were more segments before, it looked a little strange. And I don't use the vertices one that often. Maybe I've used it once or twice in my life using Blender, but I've never used it more than that. Now with edges, let's bring it back to 0.05. You're going to notice that they're not that smooth, and many beginners will start to crank this up, but even then you're not going to get a smooth edge. So if you want to get a smoother edge, you can either go with a subdivision surface, but even then it's going to look a little strange because with subdivision, you're not actually getting square segments unless you put simple, and even then it's not going to smooth it down. So what I do is remove this, and then I right click on the cube and then do shade smooth, and immediately it's smooth. And let's go back to 3 segments, and you're going to find that it doesn't really change that much, but you can see a little bit of ragged edges over here. So if I add now the subdivision modifier, it should work a little bit, but you're going to have to increase the levels. And be careful not to just increase the level viewport over here or the 3D view levels, because this is what you're going to see here. But when it renders, it's going to render on 2, so it's going to look like this. I always keep it at 1 for levels viewport, and I don't mind not seeing the actual results from the render view, and then just crank up the render view if I want it to be 3. Sometimes I test it out just to see that it works, but then I reduce it just so things are smooth here when I move the mouse, and then I can just keep the render over here at 3. But when it comes to bevel, if I want the roundness to be perfect, then I don't really add a subdivision. There are other uses for a subdivision in my workflow, and this is not usually it. So I'm going to just remove it, and we're going to get a clean bevel. Now, if you want to also remove that unsmoothness over here, you can just add more segments, but don't go over 4 or 5 maximum, because the more you have, then with UV unwrapping and all the other stuff that you might want to add, it's going to be a hassle. So yeah, I just keep it at 3. And each object is going to give you a different look, so experiment with the objects that you have. You can add mesh, and then you can add, let's say, a cylinder. It's going to give you a different look. If I add this right now and then I shade smooth, or you can even shade auto smooth, but it doesn't work all the time. Sometimes with straight edges, if you have edges that you don't want to smooth down, then you can just do auto smooth. But for me, the majority of the time I use shade smooth, and you can see that it smoothed it down. Okay, let's just delete this. And then let's also deactivate the bevel over here. And you see how shade smooth looks so weird? So if I go back to shade flat, you can see that we get our normal cube back. Now, what if I wanted to bevel just one edge? Then that's when I get into edit mode. And you can go to edit mode from the top left corner over here, or you can hit the tab button. The tab button goes from object mode to edit mode. That's the default shortcut for it. There are definitely other things that you can go into, but because edit mode is the most used one, then the tab works for it perfectly. And as you can see, it's all selected. So let's select outside to deselect all. And I'm going to go to the edges mode on the top left corner over here. And now I can select edges. So even if I click on the face, it doesn't really do anything. This is vertices. So if I select any of the vertices, and if I select two vertices, that means I'm selecting an edge. But if I go to edge mode, then I'm selecting only edges. So let's say I want to bevel this edge alone. Then I can just select it, and then either go to over here, bevel, and select it, and then you can move it up and down and it's beveling it. Or you can go back to the select box and then hit Command B on a Mac or Control B on a Windows, and it's going to do the same thing. But it's better with a shortcut, because if you click now outside, you see that we still have the selection, so I can select something else and then do the shortcut. But if you hit bevel over here and then you change things, it's going to stick with the bevel until you actually change the tool. And now let's say I release the mouse before I actually got the right width, or I couldn't measure the right width that I wanted. Then I can go down here before selecting anywhere else. I can go down here to the redo menu. This is where you can adjust whatever you just did. So if you added a cube, then you can adjust things here. But once you click outside, you cannot get back to it, especially if you did something else, unless you hit the F9 key, and you can get back to it. But don't click anything else, because this acts as if it's an undo thing. So it only goes back to the last tool that you've used. Because I haven't used any other tool or clicked or selected anything else, then the F9 works as a undo the last operation. So for me, the last operation is the bevel, and now I can adjust the width of my bevel. And I can also add segments. And it's the same thing as the bevel modifier, but you can be a little bit more specific, as in select an edge or a vertex. You can also go to vertices and then do the same thing and only select the vertices of the edge that you selected. But I always use the edge. Let's say I want to round this a little bit. So you want to bevel at different degrees over here. I also like to do clamp overlap. It's by default turned on in the bevel modifier, but here it's not, because if you don't do it, then some of the points might overlap, and this will avoid that. And note that with this, it's a destructive workflow. So if you bevel using edit mode, then know that you cannot go back unless you undo it, and you always have an undo limit with any software really. So either have a backup of your object if you want to bevel it, just to get back to it before you beveled it. Maybe you want to make the bevels smaller, or you want to change something. So anyway, just keep that in mind before you start doing anything here. And then you can also change the shape. And the shape is basically how the bevel is going to look. Like, is it going outward or is it going inward? If you go 0.5, then that's the default, or that's what you usually see surrounding the edge normally. But say I wanted to go inward, then I can just do this. And now I have a cutout. And every time I move my mouse outside of the panel, it'll disappear. So I have to hit F9 again. Now, the last thing that I wanted to show you in this bevel panel is the profile type. Now this is the default, which is just rounding it up, but there are other custom presets. So if you hit custom, so for instance, let's say a molding, say you want to make a room, or you want to create molding on a beam or anything like that, then you can do that over here. Or you can do something that makes your job much easier, like steps. So let's say you want to make steps. You can just use this preset and voila, you have steps that you can add to any of your projects. And you can also create your default. So let's say I want to change this to like that. So however you change this curve is going to change your bevel. Let's go back to the default or the normal profile type that we have already.
If you follow along with this tutorial, then please show me your experiments with this curve. Like, what did you create? How bevel helped you in creating the model that you want just using this curve.
Okay, moving on to the next thing that I want to show you. Let's get out of edit mode by hitting the tab key. And let's also delete this. So if I hit X and then delete, and following up with the previous tutorial, I showed you how you can bevel an imported SVG or specifically curves with faces. But there's another way I use bevel with curves when I draw directly in Blender or import it as an SVG line like we did in the last tutorial when I made a mistake of not converting my stroke into a shape that has faces. So for example, if you add a Bezier curve, so if you go to add and then curve Bezier, without changing much to it, let's just go to the curves properties or the object data properties. I think it's called the same for everything, but for me, I just call it curves properties because I want to note that it's a curve right now. And then go to geometry like we did last time. And then under bevel over here, I can increase the depth and see what happens. Before, when I added an SVG, when I added the bevel or the depth bevel, I only got a little bit of a rounding around my shape, but with a line, you can actually make tubes. I use it in a lot of projects where I want to create lines or let's say wires or tubes or pipes. So let's say I want to go into edit mode and then select all. I hit A to select all, and then I hit X, delete all vertices, and then I go here and draw with a pencil. So this way, I like to go to front view, clicking 1, and then I hit the / key just to hide the camera or to basically hide all objects but the selected object so I can focus on my object. And then I hit the draw over here, and then I can draw anything I want. So let's say I want a wire that looks like this. And it was a little weird when I drew it because I already have a depth. So if I hit 0, it's just a line. And then I can increase the depth a little bit. And if you want to increase the resolution, you can. But I like to just add a subdivision surface. And that adds some smoothness to it. If you just deactivate this, you can see the difference. And then I go into the points and I adjust them. So if I hit G and then Y, I can move it front or back, however I want it to look, to make a more realistic wire or rope or anything that you're trying to create. And then I hit another point, again, just move it backward. And if you click even on the control points, you can also move them with G or scale them with S or even rotate them with R. And then if I go to the curves properties, I can also fill the caps over here from the bevel menu as well. And you can see that it closes those holes. And now I've used bevel not only to round edges on a mesh, but even to create something like a rope or wires that I've used multiple times in my projects. And I usually go with 0.01, or if I'm trying to create neon lights, then I'll go even higher and then add lights inside of them, or add a smaller tube, just copy the same one and then add a smaller one inside of it, and then make the depth even smaller, and that will be the light, and the outside will be the glass for the neon lights. And that's it. Today's tutorial is a very easy one that you can experiment with, and one that can elevate your projects and make them a little bit more realistic, because in real life, nothing is not beveled. Now, once I finish creating the thumbnail, I'll come back and explain how I did everything there. Okay, let's talk about my thumbnail. Don't worry about the sphere, it's just a placeholder. In my thumbnail, I tried to feature some things that I use constantly and some things that I think it would be beneficial for anyone to know that it can be created using bevel. Let's start with the simplest things, or this right corner. The first one is just a simple bevel with one vertex selected. So I used edit mode and then the bevel tool, just selected one vertex and beveled it, didn't even add any segments to it. And then the second one is one I also showed in the tutorial where you can change the profile, so the shape basically, whether you want it to go inward or outward. And I only selected one edge. And then the third one, I used the custom profiles and used the step preset or the steps preset. And then I also added the bevel modifier to all of them, just to bevel the other edges that I haven't beveled using the bevel tool in edit mode. So these edges look smooth now because I added the bevel modifier to all of them. So for me, bevel here had two uses. The edit mode one actually changed the shape of the cube, and the modifier one just smoothed everything down, so it looks a little bit more realistic. Because if I looked at it in shading over here, and let's get a close-up, and then let's remove the bevel modifier or deactivate it, and I'm going to also not show or outline the selected so we can see it better.
That's only because it has a subdivision.
So you can see how it looks weird. Even the segments on the bevel from the edit modifier is not looking great. But if I activate this, then it looks better. Now I have a sheen over here. It actually segments the cube perfectly, and you can actually see that this is a corner rather than a cube that looks more 2D and has just different shadings. And if I bring back the subdivision modifier, then it smooths the segments down even more. And I also have shade smooth on it. And then for the second one, which is also one of the simplest ones over here, is this, and I only used the edit mode tool, the bevel tool in edit mode, and I used the custom preset for molding. And then this little fox over here, which I only created because I want to read the second book in the Thursday Murder Club, and I wanted to add that because I'm making this post in September, which is when I want to read the second book in the series. And with this one, because it's an SVG, it imports as a curve with a flat surface. I did add a bevel in the curve's properties that would look different from this one just because I converted it into a mesh later on. And I added a very small bevel to the outer edges of this curve. So you can see the theme for the bottom corner, it's all curves, and then the theme for the top right corner is all just simple bevel with presets. So for this one is just a simple line that I drew and then beveled it without any extruding. So it looks more like a plastic tube or a wire, like a phone wire that is a little bit more shiny than a regular one. And lastly, I used bevel here in a more realistic way.
I'm not sure if I meant realistic or artistic.
So for this one, I beveled one vertex in the middle of a plane, kind of like this. So let's say I add a plane and rotate it just so you can see it. And I go into edit mode. I did subdivide it once at least, or I think, yeah, once. And then I selected the vertex in the center, hit Command B, bevel it, but it's not going to bevel because it is on edge right now, and selecting one vertex doesn't really select an edge. But if I go to vertex and I add more segments, it's going to look more like a star. And then I select it all, scale it on the x-axis so I get more like a star shape, deleted the corner vertices, selected all of it with A, and then I extrude it. If you want to extrude, it's just E, but this is not our tutorial for today. And then I added a bevel, like an overall bevel. But because it has too many faces, it's not going to work unless I actually remove the clamp overlap and I make it really small. And then there is a way to remove any overlapping points, but we'll talk about that later in some other video. And finally, shade it smooth and add a subdivision surface. Let's try it without bevel because I don't remember if I added a bevel or not. It should have a bevel. Yeah, I'm not sure anymore. I think I just added a subdivision surface. I'm not sure if I applied it or not. Let's select it and see. Yeah, I do have a bevel, but I'm not sure if it actually worked. Let's see. I can delete this right now. that's basically what I did. So I did use the vertex bevel, but in a more creative way. Yes, I do have a bevel over here. So maybe my new one had edges that are very close to each other, so it didn't really allow for a bevel. But here I did add a bevel, and I do have a subdivision surface with a value of 2 for render, but as you can see, it's not actually that smooth because, as I said before, I don't really care about the viewport or how I see it in the viewport, but I just tested out and 2 works fine, so I know that for render 2 is fine or perfect, and so I just go back to 1, so things are not that heavy on here. And then I added just a simple circle or a cylinder and made it really small, and then added a bevel to it and also a subdivision surface. I know I added a subdivision just because of the weird wireframe. Let's actually go to wireframe. You can see how it's strange because of this type, which I cannot pronounce, as opposed to simple, which looks like this. So yeah, sometimes this ruins things, but here it works perfect. Let's go to solid view. And the last thing is this weird shape that looks like a ring, which uses bevel in a more unconventional way. So if I remove the subdivision or deactivate it in the viewport and deactivate the wireframe, you're gonna see how it looks actually. And if I go into edit mode, you can see that I selected all of the vertices and I beveled with the vertex selected. And then I deleted the top part and the bottom part of the sphere. And then I added a wireframe. You cannot see it in edit mode unless you select this part. You can actually see it. So yeah, if I go out of edit mode, now everything that is a face is empty and everything that is an edge is skinned with geometry, and that's what wireframe does. So I played with bevel as a way to make a cool looking wireframe, and this is what I did with one of my projects where I talked about all of the books I bought recently, and I had baskets, and in that I used this process. So I added a wireframe and then a subdivision surface, but I didn't really use bevel. I just created the edges myself, but this could have been a much easier look. And then for some of the baskets, I just left it this way, and some others I added a subdivision because that makes for a more interesting shape. And again, I test out 2 subdivision levels just to see how it's going to look in render view. And you can also shade it smooth if you want. But I like some geometry sometimes. So if you want to create like a disco ball, shade smooth is not going to work. So if I added a sphere and I want it to shade this, if it's flat like this, and it's going to mimic a disco ball. But if I shade it smooth, it's just going to be a regular sphere. And you can see it in when you add materials, how the light shines, because it calculates normals here as if they are facing different areas without any smoothness. But if you shade smooth, then it's going to transition calculating the normal with a higher resolution. So shade smooth isn't always the right choice. It depends on what you're trying to create. Let's just undo this. And the book I downloaded from CG Trader, either for free or I paid for it. I'm not 100% sure, but it already had a bevel modifier on it to bevel the edges of the book so it looks more natural. You're going to see a lot of 3D designers use bevel as a way to add sheen to the corners so it doesn't look fake. And then for the text, I did exactly what I did with this one, but with a little bit more bevel. And you can actually see how I made something like this without the cloth modifier, so without puffing it up. But you can see how I applied bevel to something like text or an SVG. Then I added the cloth modifier and I puffed it up, which is my favorite thing to do. And yeah, bevel is one of the things that you're going to find yourself using in almost every project because it really helps elevate your work. And I cannot stress enough how many times I've seen people create something extremely cool but is ruined by not adding a bevel, just a very, very small bevel to add sheen to the corners or the right places where there should be some bevel in real life. Unless you're just trying to add toon shaders or creating something that has the movements of 3D but isn't necessarily going to be exported as 3D, then you're not going to use Bevel. So that's why I said most of the time. Okay, that's it. And as always, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.